cities. Bulging with 16 million people, it straddles the Nile River not far from the ancient capital of Memphis. For more than 5,000 years, since the days of the pharaohs, Egypt has been a land of intense faith and spirituality. In many ways, it became a crossroads for some of the world's most prominent religions. Here in Cairo, the greatest Muslim metropolis on earth, one has only to listen to be reminded. The cacophony of modern life is punctuated 5 times each day by the Islamic call to prayer. Cairo is filled with hundreds of mosques of all ages and sizes. The great mosque of Sultan Hassan was built in the 14th century. It is a stunning display of enormous spiritual inspiration. But Judaism and Christianity have also found strength and motivation in this city, and their temples of faith are also here. The Ben Ezra synagogue was built in the 9th century. Legend has it that before the Nile shifted its banks, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby Moses on this spot. Cairo has numerous churches as well. Most are Coptic, a sect that was one of the earliest branches of Christianity. I visited the 4th century Hanging Church, where it's possible to sense the unbroken spiritual ties to Egypt's ancient past. If one were to find the look and sound of ancient Egypt today, then it would be here, at a Coptic church. The words of these prayers and chants are the closest clues we have to the spoken language of the ancient Egyptians. And the devout faith of this service is a direct link to the deep spirituality of pharaonic Egypt. The chants, the incense, the hieroglyphs still used in the Coptic language can be traced to an even earlier religion that began here more than 50 centuries ago. Today, Cairo's houses of worship serve as a tangible link to that time. A time when magnificent temples provided the spiritual foundation for one of humankind's first great civilizations. The power of ancient Egypt's pharaohs was rooted in a complex hierarchy of gods and goddesses. It was a religion that prized ritual and ceremony. The temple was its centerpiece, a place of wonder and mystery.
Temples were points of contact between humanity and the divine. And the Egyptians basically conceived of the temple first and foremost as the god's dwelling place. So the basic purpose of the temple ritual was the care and feeding of the god.
The second function of the temple was to physically represent the Egyptian concept of creation. Egyptians believed that the world began as a morass of primeval muck, a place of chaos and disorder. But from this morass, the gods pushed up a mound or island of safety, which became Egypt. To symbolize this mound of creation, temples were always built with a slightly raised section in their center. The temple mound reminded Egyptians that the primeval chaos could return if the gods were not happy. For over 3,000 years, fear of chaos and longing for order were central to religious beliefs of Egyptian civilization. The line between the two was very clear to the Egyptian. The desert was chaos and the absence of life. The valley, nourished by the river Nile, was security. The temple was the institution that kept Egypt safe.
The god assured stability. It prevented chaos. You know that in the center of that temple, the God is there watching over you, and that Pharaoh on your behalf is going to make the proper offerings to that God, and that the world will continue to function properly. The Nile will rise, the floods will come, food will grow. It's all a reciprocal process that continues throughout time.
Temples quickly evolved to represent more than a home for the gods. They became the focus of all life in the community.
When you think about the temple in ancient Egypt, you're really thinking about something that's much broader than a religious place. It's a religious and economic place, something akin to, say, a great monastery in the Middle Ages in Europe. It owns land, it has herds. These were great economic institutions within the structure of Egypt.
The first temples date from the birth of Egyptian civilization over 4,000 years before the Christian era. These earliest holy places were probably little more than walls of reed mats or animal hides. Later temples were built of mud brick. Amazingly, some of these structures have survived. The huge mud brick temple of the early pharaoh Khazakemwi at Abydos is over 5,000 years old. But Khazakemwi's great walls were the exception. Most of these early temples vanished long ago, worn away by the relentless desert wind. This is a mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the Egyptian sun. Every early building from the pharaoh's palace to the peasant's hovel was made of this. In the right dry conditions, these can last for thousands of years, like at Khazakemwi's temple in Abydos. But most of habitable Egypt was close to the Nile and subject to constant flooding. After a few centuries, this stuff just dissolves back into the Nile. And the Egyptians knew it. Now, that's all right for the houses of the living. After all, life is just a temporary stage. But for the tombs of the dead and the temples of the gods, they had to last. The Egyptians were about to become the world's greatest masters of a new material, stone. And with it, they created some of the greatest monuments in human history. We've seen the beginnings of temple construction in Egypt, and now we see its magnificent culmination. This is the Temple of Karnak. And after the pyramids, it is the most spectacular architectural achievement in the history of Egypt. It is the greatest temple complex ever built. It grew to cover over 60 acres, a space large enough to enclose the Cathedral of Notre Dame and its grounds. Karnak Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile in what was once Thebes, the southern capital of ancient Egypt. Today, it is the city of Luxor, some 450 miles south of Cairo. A succession of pharaohs built and expanded this great temple over the course of 2 centuries, some 1,200 years before the Christian era. This great collection of gateways and column-filled halls was built to honor a single deity, Amun, the king of the gods.
He is the great god, the #1 god in Egypt. Because of that position as king of the gods, he receives the favor of Pharaoh. And all of the great halls that exist in here, the pylons and everything, are built for him.
Along with his wife, Mut, the goddess of motherhood, Amun ruled over the capital of Thebes. It was Amun, more than any other deity, who served to legitimize and continually renew the authority of the pharaohs. In the darkest, most silent recesses of Karnak, the god Amun resided in the form of a statue. Surprisingly, the statue was not a huge colossus, but a small image that could be easily carried during festivals. The lengthy walls of Karnak were made of huge sandstone blocks. the construction challenges faced by the builders were enormous.
Remember, we're not talking about cranes or even simple block and tackle to lift these enormous stones into place. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on dirt. Here we see the remnants of an enormous ramp up which the stones were dragged to their place in this huge pylon or gateway. As each course of stone was completed, the ramp was raised. When at last the wall was completed, the ramp was slowly dug away, and each course of stone was dressed with carvings and paintings on the way down.
The great hypostyle hall is the heart of Karnak. Begun by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC, the hall is a forest of 130 columns, which once supported a roof over 80 feet above the temple floor. Windows in the roof admitted light which flooded the dramatic central aisle. But the side aisles, so sunny today, then would have remained in dramatic shadow. 15 obelisks dedicated to the sun god Re were lifted into place throughout the temple. It took all of the engineering skill possessed by Egyptians to carve the massive shafts, drag them up dirt ramps, and carefully settle them into place. The tips of the obelisks were once capped with gold, so they might catch the first sunlight at dawn and the last at twilight. The glinting light from these shafts honored the sun's primary importance to sustaining all life. This great collection of monumental stonework was not erected by slaves, but by free citizens, for all Egyptians were expected to be available sometime during the year to work on the pharaoh's great construction projects. It was the equivalent of national service.
The labor that put these temples together is the common people. They're serving their labor time. It's their week to go work in Karnak. It's probably, one, we've got to pay our taxes. Two, we're working on the home of the god. This is a great service to the king and to Amun. We're ensuring the stability of life throughout eternity by building here.
Although average working-class Egyptians built this temple, they probably were allowed to enter only the outer courtyards during the festivals. These inner halls were entered only by the most elite class of priests, for it was here that the god's spirit was most present. Each pharaoh in his turn felt called on to proclaim his devotion to Amun, and while he was at it, his own greatness. The walls and columns of the temple functioned as posters or billboards, where the king's adoration of the god could be recorded and displayed to the world. Dr. William Murnane of the University of Memphis has been studying the inscriptions at Karnak Temple for over 30 years.
I guess my interest in this building starts with simple curiosity. I mean, it is so well preserved, and it's silly not to know very much about what made it tick, why it was built. I'm interested in what it tells us about the religious mentality of the ancient Egyptians. The only safe way you can begin to understand what the significance of a building like this is to understand what they carved on its walls.
Simple photography of the inscriptions is difficult. Over hundreds of years and a succession of pharaohs, carvings were placed on top of older carvings. Murnane carefully traces everything so that all the layers may then be minutely studied. For sometimes, these images are not what they first appear.
One of the things that you find constantly being emphasized in the temple is this balance between the way things are and ought to be and what's actually happening in the temple. And I think you see that very nicely illustrated over here. You have this bird, which is a hieroglyph for the common people of Egypt. And notice it's seated on a basket, which is another hieroglyph, which means all. And the bird has sprouted arms. It's not because it's a genetic mutation, but because this is part of another hieroglyph. Egyptians, seeing those arms outstretched, would think of instantly the word for adore. And in case you missed the point, the star. The five-pointed star is another Egyptian hieroglyph that basically means adore. So you've got all the people